The V2 ripples are finally here and produce quite literally the most effortless power of any paddle currently on the market, so let's break these down and see what they're made of, literally. I've had a lot to think about and try to incorporate on this one, so in the spirit of trying to keep it as simple as possible, here are my 3 take-home bottom line concepts. Number 1, based on my personally collected data and my subjective opinion and analysis thereof, the new Ripple V2 series appears to be the new top of legally producible power. Number 2, for as much mystery and confusion as there seems to have been, the design changes of the V2 Ripple are actually quite simple and very similar to previous Ripples, which I'll show in my dissection. Number 3, whatever a person's opinion of the V2s are, nobody really knows what these paddles will play like after a month or two, and I do expect to see at least a little bit more of a break-in period like we saw on previous Ripples, where the paddle begins to hit a little hotter, the sweet spot expands and spin rates increase, while controllability subsequently decreases. With this channel's discount code PBMED, you can take the final price of a V2 Ripple to $260. And as high as that price is, I can guarantee you these are gonna sell quickly, especially the R4 hybrid shape. As a small item of housekeeping, these new V2 Ripples are obviously USAP approved, and they can be found on the official USAP approved paddle list. I explored that in a lot of detail on a previous video, so I won't spend so much time on it here, but suffice it to say, these seem to be here to stay for the long haul. The V2 has 3 shapes, all of which are 14mm thick and include the elongated R1.14, the standard shape R2.14, and now Ronbus's first hybrid shape paddle, the R4.14. I'll put the measured stats of all 3 on the screen here for you to pause and look at more closely if you'd like, and I'll point out that the elongated R1 in particular does have both a swing weight and balance point that are on the higher side, which are the 2 things that make a paddle feel more heavy in the hand. The standard shaped R2 has pretty manageable numbers with a very high twist weight for a paddle with a foam core, and the hybrid R4 sort of splits the difference with a pretty manageable swing weight and a balance point that's still on the higher side, likely due to its slightly flared face shape, putting more weight out towards the end of the paddle face. These are actually perfect examples of paddles that benefit greatly from adding some weight to the butt end of the handle, and I did a quick peel and stick to add a 9-gram flick weight to each of these paddles, which moved the balance point down 9 whole millimeters on the R1 and R4, and 8mm on the standard shaped R2. Those numbers may not sound like a lot on their own, but that's actually a pretty significant change in the center of gravity and the perceived maneuverability on these paddles, and made these paddles much easier to turn over in the hand, and made it easier to add additional weight up at the head for further customization. As a very quick review of Ripple paddle history, the 3 most important Ripples, not all models, just the most pertinent comparisons, in the Ripple timeline are the Beta Ripple, which is the Ripple most people have played with and tested with the palpable waves on the paddle face, then the Ripple that was labeled the Production Ripple, which was set to release in January of 2025, and now the V2 Ripple, which will be the models released and reviewed here now. I'm going to go ahead and jump into my dissection now, and I'll warn you, I got really deep into the weeds on this one, so if that sort of thing doesn't interest you, feel free to skip this and go on to the gameplay stuff afterwards. One noteworthy thing to mention right away is the Ripple face is adhered very tightly. This is by far the single most difficult paddle face I've ever tried to remove. Underneath that face, you'll discover the Fire core, which is basically an EVA foam core, the bulk of which is separated into channels wrapped in a carbon fiber lattice. When the face is still on the paddle, a lot of the new Ripples have visible waves on the face you can actually feel, just like the Betas did, but once that face is taken off, the waves go away, which made it incredibly evident that the waves that could be felt on the face were caused by something inside the paddle. This is a little hard to show on camera, but the tallest part of each of those channels running up the paddle face is actually at the edge of each one of them, where that carbon fiber lattice runs in between the foam segments from the front face to the back paddle face, with some subsequent drooping where the lattice runs across each channel, which is what causes the waves on the face as those channel edges press up into it. I'll show on screen here all 3 Ripples we'll talk about, which is an R1 Beta, an R1 Production Ripple, and a V2 R2, which is the one Ronbus was gracious enough to provide when I asked for one to cut open. Since the shape is a little different, know there may be a small amount of variance because of that different shape, but overall the important main takeaways should be the same. Even in this R2 model, you can see where the carbon fiber channels were extended further down the paddle face compared to both the Beta and Production Ripple. the edge of which was right about here on the production ripple before I managed to mangle it all up trying to force it off. The more squishy the face is, the higher the PB core numbers are, according to Dong, Ronbus's owner, and the highest numbers they were seeing on the PB core tests were at the bottom of the face, which is why they extended the channels further downward. These channels were also previously extended upward from the beta to the production ripple to solve some edge guard problems, and at least between these two models here, you can see that the channels look even further up in the new V2 ripples. You can see here each channel is wrapped all the way around sideways, but another change we see in the V2s is that with the middle 3 channels, which take more ball impact, especially on PB core testing, have additional lattices added to cap the ends for further reinforcement. I actually cut out some individual channel pieces that you can see here, which include a segment from the beta, a segment from the production, and a section from the V2 ripple. To explore this a little deeper, I used my bandsaw to cut some straight edge rectangles out of the foam channels in each paddle and measured length, width, and height to calculate their volume. It was then easy enough to weigh them for their mass, which I could then divide by volume to tell me the foam density of each ripple. Comparing this to the foam densities I've calculated before, funny enough, the new V2s match the density of the foam in the 11624 power paddles all the way to 4 decimal places, landing it above the previous ripples by only 6/1000ths. You'll have to forgive my excessive math here, which I'll skip the explanation of and I'll just throw it on screen if you're interested, but just to illustrate how insignificant this is, this difference in density would account for a difference in mass of just over 3 grams in an R1 ripple, and that's if you are generous with your measurements. With the foam being essentially unchanged model to model, the frankly obvious culprit for changes in feel, gross weight, swing weight, etc. is the carbon fiber lattice. If you look at the swing weights of these 3 models, it's pretty clear you can track the increase in those swing weights with the increase of carbon fiber reinforcement at the top of the production model, and then that plus the increase in carbon fiber reinforcement at the bottom of the V2 ripple, accounting for jumps in swing weight from model to model. I did side-by-side testing on the same day using the same balls and in the same conditions for serve speed and RPM measurements of the Ripple V2 series, the 2 YOLO Pro 4 Perseus models, and my Beta R2 ripple, since I cut my Beta R1 open before last launch and I can no longer test that one, and I'll put the results on screen here. While numbers alone don't tell the whole story, I was recording higher drive speeds on my elongated V2 R1.14 than any other paddle that day, and that was with a pretty well broken in YOLO Perseus in both the 16 and 14mm thicknesses, and a relatively unbroken in elongated V2 R1. I also put up marginally higher speeds on my standard shaped V2 R2 than my Beta R2, but those numbers are pretty much indistinguishable in terms of speed you can actually perceive. One notable difference I think can give some people perceptions of more or less power is the amount of effort it takes to generate that power. I'll illustrate this via a few graphs, which I know may oversimplify this just a little, but big picture here, this is sort of how I view this. A typical Gen 1 or Gen 2 paddle has a pretty linear effort to power ratio, and by power, I mean velocity produced on drives. A pretty common pattern seen in a lot of Gen 3 foam-enhanced paddles is an exponential pattern seen with the amount of effort a person puts into swings compared to the amount of velocity seen out the other side until a ball speed reaches its maximum point. This is certainly the case with the ripples, YOLOs, and others, but the size of that effort to power ratio or the slope of the graph varies from paddle to paddle. Bearing in mind that these are just visual representations of my personal perception, the original beta ripples seem to have the steepest curved graph, meaning they hit their peak velocity with the least amount of effort, which I feel is due to their incredibly lightweight design, making it easy to swing really quickly, followed by the V2 ripples and then the YOLO Pro 4s. While all of these hit a very high speed on drives, I do feel that the V2 hits that ultra high velocity with the least amount of effort of any paddle currently on the market, considering the beta ripples are no longer a thing, stealing the top power crown from the Pro 4s both in terms of raw mile per hour measurements and the relatively effortless energy it takes to get to those numbers. While the spin is very high on all of these paddles, the highest spinner of them all was the Beta R2 ripple. I would suspect this has to do with the extra foam at the top and bottom of the beta core that is not enclosed in the carbon fiber lattice, thus allowing the core to flow a little more freely and absorb the ball more. Again, I truly don't know what a real full break-in for the V2 ripple is going to do for power and spin on these, but considering it's the same foam and carbon fiber used in previous models, I do think we'll see changes in these numbers over time. Overall, gameplay for these is probably about what you'd expect it to be. On big swings, blocks, and punches, all the V2 ripples hit very, very hard. Pop was super fast, and I still feel like there really isn't another paddle out there I'd rather get in a hands battle with. Another strong perk is vibration reduction. I never felt any harsh feelings being transmitted back into my hand when I hit the ball, which was nice, but this also may be a con for people who don't like the more muted feel and like to feel where the ball hits the face a little bit more. Spin during gameplay always felt really high from the beginning, and to be honest, nothing has really changed for me over the last few weeks in that regard. The only thing I've particularly noticed over time, however, is the benefit these have with spinning at the kitchen line. It seems to take less energy and forward motion to activate the spin for things like brushes and rolls than paddles with a much larger dwell time like the 16mm 𝐍𝐄𝐄 Pro 4s that spin a little better with more forward motion and ball absorption. Control on all these seem to depend on whether or not a person can swing with smooth, steady swings and not short, stiff, jerky swings, because as the graph before illustrated, sudden jumps in energy going into the paddle lead to pretty high velocity coming off the other end.
And as long as you get that paddle face moving fast, which is good and bad, it can send a lot of balls long if you struggle with control. But if you can really hone in your control, if you have more smooth strokes,
yes,
you can play a lot better with the ripple. If you have those smoother strokes where you can just nice and like a controlled stroke and then let the paddle do the work, versus if you're kind of jumpy or twitchy with it, it'll kind of sling it.
Yeah, you reach that exponent really quick. The elongated R1 had the most power on drives for sure, but I did think it needed a little bit of weight for stabilization. Because it had a swing weight that was already on the higher side, I added the 9-gram flick weight to the end of the handle to lower the balance point and allow me to add a bit of weight up by the head. I am a nearly 200-pound guy, and I actually prefer my swing weights pretty high after I add weight, so this wasn't too much of a problem for me, but I do think that for most people, the R1 is going to be a bit on the heavy side for their preference. The standard shape R2 definitely felt the most springy out of the box, and like a lot of wide body or standard shape paddles, and I think the face felt a little more loose from the beginning than the other two V2s, and this one had the best sweet spot stock as well. The R4 Hybrid has been the paddle that I've been drawn to the most, which I'm guessing will be a common theme among several of the different reviewers. It seems to have a bit of the best of both worlds here, with some of the leverage and reach of the R1, but with a slightly better sweet spot and a swing weight that most people probably find a little bit more friendly. To touch on the comparison I think is probably most important, in my mind there are really two standouts at the top of the power ceiling, which include the V2 Ripples and the 𝐍𝐄𝐄 Pro 4s. Obviously, I think I've stated I think the V2 Ripples hit just a little harder than the 𝐍𝐄𝐄s and get there with less effort, but that goes for both hitting harder shots and receiving them.
I would say that R1 Ripple noticeably hit harder and felt like I was hitting harder than the Perseus Pro 4, which was clear to me when I was hitting serves, and then when I was ripping drives at you, I switched to that. I switched the paddle out.
Yeah, oh yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah, so I had started, ripping drives at Dustin.
I was at the kitchen. He was like, oh, hit some drives. He's hitting with the Pro 4,
Perseus.
Right?
Yeah. And then I think we used both balls, and you went to go grab yours.
Yeah, I turned around, I grabbed the ball, and he switched, and I didn't see he switched.
Yeah, and then I started hitting with the ripple, and it felt harder to me. And you also were like,
I was like, oh. Like, that feels the same. That feels the same as the ripple. Like, that's coming really fast now. He must have changed his swing, or he's like actually trying. I'm like, oh, that's like really fast.
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh, you're hitting the ripple again. Like, I knew it.
Yeah.
I also think the V2s are a little more poppy, which also means a little harder to control by comparison. And another difference people will notice is feel. The 𝐍𝐄𝐄s, especially the 16mm ones, are really more for people who like a much higher dwell time and ball absorption, and while a paddle like the Franklin C45 is on the other end of the spectrum with almost no dwell time, the Ripple seems to sit right about the middle and has a slightly more dampened feel than the Pro 4s as well. Overall, I think the V2 series is the new top of legally producing power. The Hybrid R4 was the standout shape for me here, as it seemed to have a good mix of the reach and power of the R1, but with a better sweet spot and the friendlier swing weight. As a person who does have more jerky and stiff movements from time to time, I did think these were not the friendliest for people who struggle with control. It's also worth noting that there seems to be a lot of mixed opinions about the power and spin on these, which I have found pretty surprising, so the best thing I can say is to watch a few reviews and see what resonates the most with you when weighing your options here. And that's my take on the new Ripple V2 series. Like always, I hope the review was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and I'll catch you here for the next one.